crowd gathered at Cypress Grove Cemetery in Montgomery, Alabama, stood solemnly around the freshly dug grave, the cool breeze gently carrying their murmurs through the air. They had come to pay their respects to Robert Henley, a man known far and wide for his charitable work and kind heart. The polished black headstone gleamed under the afternoon sun, a quiet testament to the life he had lived, a life of service, a life of sacrifice. The mourners, a mix of family, friends, and acquaintances, exchanged soft pleasantries, their voices hushed by the gravity of the moment. Among the mourners, however, one person stood apart, not by her own doing, but by the undeniable weight of her presence. She was an elderly woman, dressed in a simple yet elegant green dress, the soft fabric flowing gently around her frame. Her silver hair was neatly tucked under a modest hat, and she clutched a single red rose in her hands, her fingers steady despite the obvious emotion in her eyes. While the others gathered in small clusters, talking amongst themselves, few paid her any attention. She remained at the edge of the crowd, silent, but her very presence seemed to command a sense of quiet reverence. It wasn't until the pastor finished his final prayer that she slowly began to make her way toward the front. The soft crunch of gravel beneath her heels was the only sound as the mourners parted to let her through, a ripple of curiosity spreading through the crowd as they wondered who this woman was and what her connection to Robert could possibly be. When she reached the grave, she paused, looking down at the polished casket that sat before her. The moment hung in the air as she carefully placed the red rose atop the casket, her hands trembling slightly as if honoring a love and loss deeper than anyone around her could imagine. She turned then, facing the crowd, and the murmurs of confusion and curiosity grew louder as her voice broke the stillness. "My name is Hattie DeLay," she began, her voice steady, clear, but filled with a depth of emotion that caused everyone present to fall silent. "I doubt many of you know me, but I knew Robert better than anyone here." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Faces turned toward one another, brows furrowing in confusion. Whispers filled the air as questions arose. Who was this woman? How could she claim to know Robert so intimately? The mystery behind Hattie's words hung in the air, and the crowd's curiosity grew. Hattie's eyes scanned the sea of faces before her. Her expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable resolve in her gaze. She wasn't here for sympathy or attention. "Before today ends," she continued, her voice unwavering, "you'll understand why I'm here. And you'll understand Robert Henley as none of you ever have." Her words lingered in the air like a promise, one that no one could ignore. Hattie paused, letting the weight of her statement settle. As the wind rustled the leaves around them, the murmurs of the crowd slowly died down, leaving only the faint rustling of nature and the heavy silence that enveloped the group. The crowd leaned in, their eyes fixed on her, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything they thought they knew about the man they had come to honor. With a deep breath, Hattie began her story, her voice carrying a calm authority that demanded everyone's attention. "I met Robert 50 years ago," she said, her voice soft yet strong, as if the memories she was about to share were as fresh as if they had happened yesterday. Her gaze turned distant, as if she were seeing the past unfold before her eyes. "It wasn't here in Montgomery. It was in Selma, during a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this." The crowd leaned in, their curiosity piqued. This was not the Robert Henley they knew, the polished philanthropist they'd admired. This was a side of him they had never even imagined. Hattie continued, her voice tinged with both pride and pain. "Robert was just a young man back then, full of fire and ambition. He worked as a teacher, but his heart was in the civil rights movement. That's where we crossed paths." The crowd gasped, their shock palpable. They had known Robert as a generous, kind man, but none of them had heard of his involvement in the civil rights struggles. Hattie let her words settle before pressing on, her eyes never leaving the casket. "We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice," she said, her voice softening with emotion. "We were friends. No, more than friends. We became family. When the world seemed determined to tear us apart, he was there for me. When I lost my sister to the violence of those times, I was there for him when he had to rebuild his life after being ostracized by his own." She paused, her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted her hat. The weight of her words was beginning to sink in. Hattie's voice cracked ever so slightly as she added, "He called me his sister in every way that mattered, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it out loud." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The man they had come to honor was suddenly someone they didn't recognize. The polished philanthropist, the quiet giver, was slowly being replaced by a man who had fought for justice, who had stood up in the face of oppression, and who had faced his own struggles with courage and resilience. Hattie's voice grew firmer as she continued, "What I'm telling you isn't just about the past. It's about the man he became because of those struggles," she said, her gaze scanning the crowd. "Robert wasn't the polished man you all remember. He was someone who walked through fire for the people he cared about." The crowd stood in stunned silence. The weight of Hattie's words was sinking in, and they knew that the man they had mourned was not the same man Hattie had known. As Hattie paused, her gaze unwavering as she stood before Robert's grave, the atmosphere at Cypress Grove Cemetery grew thick with anticipation. The crowd was no longer just a group of mourners. They were now an audience, drawn into a story that none of them expected to hear. Every word that left Hattie's lips seemed to pull them deeper into the past, into the real Robert Henley, the man who had been a symbol of generosity and compassion in their community, but was now revealed as someone far more complex than they had ever imagined. Hattie's voice broke the silence again as she began to weave the fabric of her shared history with Robert. "I met Robert 50 years ago in Selma, Alabama, during a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this," she began. Her voice was steady, though tinged with a rawness that spoke volumes of the pain she carried from those years. As the wind rustled through the trees, it seemed as though the past had come alive in her words, each one weighted with both pride and sorrow. The crowd shifted, some leaning in, others exchanging uncertain glances. What was she saying? Selma? The civil rights movement? Robert Henley? None of them had ever heard of this side of the man they knew as the local philanthropist, the man who had made countless donations, who had helped so many without ever asking for anything in return. But here in the quiet cemetery, the image of Robert was being shattered and remade. "We were in Selma," Hattie continued, "on the steps of a church where we were organizing sit-ins." Her eyes were distant now, as though the weight of those memories had transported her back to that pivotal moment. Robert was just a young man then, full of ambition and fire. He worked as a teacher, but his heart was in the civil rights movement. That's where we crossed paths. Gasps rippled through the crowd, their minds racing to reconcile the Robert they knew with the Robert Hattie described. Robert Henley, a man of quiet dignity and an unassuming nature, had risked everything, his career, his safety, even his reputation, to stand alongside Hattie and countless others fighting for equality. The man they had revered as a generous, charitable figure had also been a fighter, a soldier in the battle for justice. Hattie didn't pause, though. She could feel the energy in the air, the disbelief, the shock. But she had come here for a reason. She had come here to make sure that Robert's legacy was fully understood. Not just the polished version that everyone had admired, but the full truth. Robert wasn't just a man of good deeds and quiet charity, Hattie said, her voice steady but full of conviction. He was there right alongside me when things were the hardest. When I lost my sister to the violence of those times, he was there. And when he was ostracized by his own community, when the very people he had once helped turned their backs on him, I was there for him. Her words were heavy, and the weight of her confession settled over the crowd like a blanket. The man they thought they knew as a compassionate benefactor had, in fact, sacrificed so much. His comfort, his safety, his very career, for a cause larger than himself. Robert Henley had been a man of courage, yes, but also a man of deep personal pain. Someone who had borne the consequences of standing up for what was right in an era that sought to silence those like him. Hattie's voice cracked slightly as she spoke of their friendship, of the bond they had shared. "We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice, we were family," she said, her words growing soft. "We shared meals, stories, tears. Robert called me his sister in every way that mattered, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it out loud." The crowd shifted again, uneasy, as the truth about Robert began to take shape. The polished, philanthropic image of the man they had known for years began to crumble, revealing the much deeper, far more complicated person beneath. Robert had given so much of himself to the world, but there were pieces of his life that had remained hidden, pieces that Hattie was now exposing. Her next words hit like a punch. "But this isn't just about the past," she continued, her voice growing firmer. "It's about the man he became because of those struggles, the Robert most of you never knew." Hattie let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the gravity of her words sink in. The air in the cemetery felt thick, and everyone present seemed to understand that what she was about to share would change everything they had thought they knew about Robert Henley. "Robert didn't just survive those times," Hattie said, her voice now laced with sorrow and defiance. "We fought through them. But those fights demanded sacrifices, sacrifices that left marks on both of us, marks most of you would never see." The crowd stood still, entranced by Hattie's every word, and a new realization began to settle in. They had never truly understood Robert, not in the way that mattered. They had seen the man who helped, who gave, who showed up to charity events, but they had never seen the pain he had carried, the fights he had faced in silence. "Robert lost his job in 1967, Hattie said, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her hat. He lost it for attending a march in Selma. They called it unbecoming conduct, but we all knew what it really was. Retribution. He didn't tell anyone here about it because he didn't want pity." She took a deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. "After that, he packed up what little he had and moved to a small one-bedroom house on the south side of Montgomery. That's where he lived, scraping by on tutoring gigs, never once abandoning the fight." Her voice softened as she spoke of the things Robert had done for her. "When my house was firebombed in retaliation for hosting meetings, it was Robert who showed up in the middle of the night. He drove me and my nephews to safety without hesitation, knowing full well the risk." The crowd remained frozen, utterly captivated by the revelations about the man they had come to honor. Hattie's words were shaking them to their core, but she wasn't done. There was more to the story, more that Robert had kept hidden from the world, and she was going to make sure they knew the full truth. As Hattie stood there, her words still hanging in the air, the crowd was no longer just listening. They were grappling with a truth they had never expected to hear. They had come to honor Robert Henley for his charitable work and his polished public image. But now, thanks to Hattie's unflinching honesty, they were forced to confront a different side of him, a side that had remained hidden for decades, cloaked beneath the accolades and admiration that surrounded him. Hattie's voice remained steady, but there was a deep sorrow in her words as she continued. "And I didn't just survive those times," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd as if daring anyone to look away. "We fought through them, but that fight demanded sacrifices that left marks on both of us, marks most of you would never see." The words landed heavily, like a weight pressing down on everyone who had gathered to mourn Robert's passing. As the silence grew, Hattie's hand tightened around her purse, her grip firm with emotion. It was as if she was bracing herself for what she was about to reveal, one more truth about Robert that no one could have guessed. The crowd, still reeling from the earlier revelations, leaned in closer, eager to hear what would come next. "Back in 1967, Robert lost his job," Hattie continued, her voice unwavering but filled with the kind of grief that only years of sacrifice could produce. "He lost it for attending a march in Selma. The school board called it unbecoming conduct, but we all knew what it really was. It was retribution." The words rippled through the crowd and gasps echoed in the air. Robert Henley, a man who had given so much to the community, had lost his job because he had stood up for what was right. He had been punished for fighting for equality, for standing with those who had been oppressed. No one here had known that side of him, and it shook them to their core. Hattie paused for a moment, letting the weight of the revelations settle. She could see the confusion, the disbelief reflected in the eyes of the mourners. Robert Henley, the man they knew only as a philanthropist, had been a warrior in the fight for justice, and now they were finally learning the cost of that fight. He packed up everything he had and moved to a small one-bedroom house on the south side of Montgomery, Hattie said, her voice quieter now but still filled with strength. That's where he lived, scraping by on tutoring gigs, never once abandoning the fight. He didn't want pity. He didn't want anyone's sympathy. He just kept going, doing what he believed in. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile this version of Robert with the man they had known. But Hattie wasn't finished. She had more to say, and her words would continue to unravel the truth of Robert Henley's life. One of quiet sacrifice, of fighting in the shadows, of giving when it cost him everything. When my own house was firebombed in retaliation for hosting meetings, Hattie continued, her eyes glistening with the memory, it was Robert who showed up in the middle of the night. He drove me and my 2 nephews to safety without hesitation, knowing full well the risk. He didn't think twice. He was there for me, even when it meant risking his own life. The crowd stood frozen, the realization dawning on them that Robert had not just been an outwardly generous man, but someone who had endured the harshest challenges in silence. He had not asked for recognition, he had simply given, over and over, when it mattered most. Hattie's words held the crowd in a vice grip, her voice a steady beacon of truth in the midst of their disbelief. This is who Robert was, Hattie said, her voice growing firmer, more resolute. Not the polished man in the tailored suit you remember, but someone who walked through fire for the people he cared about. He gave everything to fight for justice, for the people who needed him the most. As the weight of her words settled over them, Hattie reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it up, her hands trembling slightly. This, she said, is a letter Robert wrote to me in 1972. I want to read just one part of it to you. The crowd leaned in, the silence hanging thick in the air. Hattie unfolded the letter with care, her hands shaking slightly as she began to read aloud, her voice trembling as she recalled the words Robert had written to her so many years ago. Hattie, she began, reading the words from the letter, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear, but I would carry them again for you without question. You remind me every day that love is not about blood, it's about who shows up when the world turns its back. Her voice cracked slightly as she read the final line, and the crowd shifted once again. Tears welled in Hattie's eyes, but she continued, steadying herself as she finished reading. Robert never turned his back on anyone, she said, folding the letter with care, not even when it cost him everything. The room was filled with the sound of soft sobs, some mourners dabbing at their eyes while others stared at the ground, ashamed of what they had never known about Robert. They had loved him for his generosity, but they had never understood the true depth of his sacrifices, the personal battles he had fought in silence. Hattie's voice broke the quiet once again as she addressed the crowd, her eyes piercing the air as she spoke. How many of you knew this about Robert? She asked, her voice steady but filled with a quiet challenge. How many of you cared enough to ask? The question hung in the air and the mourners stood frozen. Some were filled with guilt, others with regret, but all were left to confront the fact that they had only known the version of Robert that suited their own perceptions. The man they had come to honor, the man they had admired, was so much more than they had ever realized. Hattie's words cut through the stillness, forcing them to reckon with the truth of Robert's life and to acknowledge the depth of his sacrifices, which had shaped the man they thought they knew. The tension in the air grew thick as Hattie stood before the crowd, the truth about Robert Henley unfurling with every word she spoke. The realization was beginning to settle in, but she wasn't done yet. There was one more truth that Robert had carried with him all his life, a truth so powerful it would shake everything they thought they knew about him, and Hattie wasn't about to let them leave without knowing it. The mourners stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had already learned pressing down on them. Hattie's voice, calm and resolute, broke through the stillness once again. "But there's one more truth about Robert," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, making sure that every single person heard her words. "A truth that none of you would have guessed. It's one that shaped everything he stood for." A collective breath was held as Hattie's eyes locked with those of the mourners, her voice steady but carrying the intensity of what she was about to reveal. "Robert didn't just fight for others," she continued, her tone sharpening with every syllable. "He fought a battle that no one could see. For years, he hid the fact that he was supporting a child, a son he couldn't openly claim because of who the mother was." A ripple of shock and disbelief swept through the crowd. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment it seemed as if the earth had stopped moving. Robert Henley, the man they had known as a beacon of philanthropy and kindness, had a secret, a child he could never openly acknowledge because of the very society they lived in. Hattie let the silence linger, watching the stunned faces before her. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. She was determined to make sure that the truth about Robert's life, his sacrifices, and the things he had hidden from the world were fully understood. "His son, Samuel," Hattie said, her voice steady as she spoke the name that was about to change everything. "Samuel was born to a woman Robert couldn't marry, not because of anything about her, but because of the time and place they lived in. The world wouldn't have allowed it. Samuel was black, just like me, and Robert was forced to keep it quiet for fear of what it would do to his career and reputation." The crowd was completely still, and the weight of the moment hit like a hammer. Samuel, Robert's son. This was a side of Robert Henley they could never have imagined. Hattie continued, her voice unwavering as she recounted the story. "I was there when Samuel was born," she said softly, her eyes meeting the crowd. "Robert made sure that boy never went without. He paid for his schooling, he wrote letters every week, and he visited whenever he could. Under the cover of darkness, he made sure Samuel had everything Robert himself had never had growing up. A father's love, even if it had to be a quiet love." The crowd was now completely captivated, their shock and disbelief slowly giving way to something deeper, awe. This was not the man they had thought they knew. Robert had kept so much of his life hidden, his sacrifices unspoken. He had given everything for the people he cared about, without ever asking for recognition, without ever seeking praise. And now the truth was coming to light. Tears welled up in Hattie's eyes, but her voice remained strong, resolute. "Samuel is here today," she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "Samuel, the man you didn't know existed, is here with us today." At that moment, a tall man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His presence was commanding, and as he walked toward Hattie, it was impossible to ignore the striking resemblance between him and Robert. The crowd gasped collectively as Samuel Henley moved forward, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of his father's hidden legacy. Samuel walked up to Hattie, his movements deliberate and calm. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a silent gesture of gratitude, of connection, and of shared history. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Hattie smiled at him through her tears, her expression softening. "It was always my honor," she replied, her voice full of warmth and love. It was a simple exchange, but it spoke volumes about the bond they shared, the bond that had been forged in the fires of struggle and sacrifice, a bond that had remained hidden from the world for far too long. Turning back to the crowd, Hattie addressed them once more, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had come before. "Robert loved all of you," she said, her gaze sweeping over the mourners, "but his truest love was in the people he fought for. Those of us who didn't have the luxury of being seen in polite society, those of us who had to fight just to be heard. That's why I'm here today, to make sure you know the real man behind all the accolades. the man you knew. The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't just shock. It was a moment of reflection, a reckoning with the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Robert Henley, the man they had come to mourn, was not just the figure of charity and philanthropy they had known. He was a fighter, a man who had made deep personal sacrifices, a man whose life had been defined by love, not just for those around him, but for his son, for the people he fought alongside, and for a cause that demanded everything from him. Hattie wasn't finished, though. There was one more story, one more act of bravery that would redefine Robert's legacy forever. The crowd stood frozen, their attention riveted on Hattie as she prepared to share this final, crucial part of the story. 2 months before Robert passed, Hattie said, her voice softer now but no less powerful, he called me. He wasn't well, but his spirit hadn't faltered. He told me he was putting together a trust. Not for himself, not for his estate, but for the children in this community. Children whose parents struggle to make ends meet. Children who deserve opportunities but are often overlooked. The crowd stirred once again, the weight of Hattie's words sinking in. Robert Henley's final act was not for himself, but for the future of others. He had planted the seed for something that would grow long after he was gone. Samuel stepped forward, his deep voice firm and steady as he spoke. "That trust is real," he said. "It's already been established, and it's going to provide scholarships, after-school programs, and mentorship for kids in need. My father wanted his life to mean something, not just to the people he knew, but to the generations that would come after him." The crowd was quiet now, reflecting on the magnitude of Robert's final gift. A legacy that would impact the lives of countless children, a gift that would live on long after his passing. Hattie looked around, meeting the eyes of each mourner, and said simply, "That was Robert's greatest gift. He didn't need recognition or applause. He just needed to know he had done his part to make the world a little better." As the mourners began to process everything Hattie had shared, the emotional weight of the moment was palpable. Some were lost in thought, others wiping away tears, but all were changed by the truth, by the sacrifices, and by the legacy of a man who had lived a life of quiet, unwavering love for others. Hattie gave one last nod to Samuel before stepping back, letting the moment settle. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the echoes of her words would stay with them forever. The cemetery stood still, the weight of Hattie's words still hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Robert Henley's life, his struggles, and his sacrifices had been laid bare for everyone to witness. The crowd, which had come to mourn a well-known philanthropist, was now grappling with the stark reality of the man they thought they knew. The polished reputation of Robert Henley, the man they had admired for his charity and kindness, had been replaced with the raw truth of a man who had fought battles most of them had never known about. And as the silence settled, Hattie wasn't finished. There was one final chapter to Robert's legacy, one more act that would leave everyone with something to think about, something to carry forward. As the mourners shifted uncomfortably, Hattie stood tall, her presence commanding yet graceful, ready to share the last piece of the story that would redefine Robert's legacy for all of them. She paused, allowing the silence to deepen, the anticipation mounting in the air. 2 months before Robert passed, she began, her voice softer now but still carrying the power of everything she had said, he called me. He wasn't well, but his spirit hadn't faltered. Hattie's eyes met those of the mourners as if daring them to look away. He told me he was putting together a trust, not for himself, but for the children in this community. The crowd was rapt, hanging on every word. Hattie continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. This trust wasn't for Robert's estate or for his own benefit. It was for the children whose parents struggled to make ends meet, children who deserve opportunities but are often overlooked. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the crowd as they began to understand the full extent of Robert's final act. The man they had admired for his generosity, who had helped countless people throughout his life, had never sought recognition for the most important gift of all, His final act wasn't one of charity. It was one of legacy, of planting a seed that would grow and nurture generations to come. Hattie's voice cracked slightly as she spoke, her emotions betraying the gravity of Robert's final wish. Robert knew he wouldn't live to see the trust in action, she said, her eyes glistening. But it didn't matter to him. What mattered to him was planting the seed, making sure it would grow long after he was gone. At that moment, Samuel, Robert's son, stepped forward, his presence commanding and powerful. His broad shoulders and quiet dignity mirrored his father's, and as he moved toward Hattie, the resemblance between the two men was unmistakable. The crowd fell silent, their eyes drawn to Samuel, who now stood beside Hattie, ready to share in his father's legacy. "That trust is real," Samuel said, his voice deep and steady, filled with the weight of his father's love and sacrifice. "It's already been established, and it's going to provide scholarships, after-school programs, and mentorship for kids in need." The words were like a breath of fresh air in the heavy silence. It wasn't just a promise anymore, it was a reality. Robert Henley's life, his struggles, and his love for the community would live on through the opportunities he had fought for. Samuel's voice rang out with certainty as he spoke. "My father wanted his life to mean something, not just to the people he knew, but to the generations that would come after him." The crowd was now completely captivated, their disbelief giving way to awe. What had started as a simple funeral had turned into something much more profound. A moment of reckoning for everyone present. They had come to honor a man, but now they were being forced to confront the full truth of his life. Robert Henley was a man who had given everything he had, not just for recognition or for accolades, but for a future he would never see. As Hattie looked around at the crowd, she saw the weight of her words settling in. She knew that Robert's legacy wasn't just about the scholarships or the programs he had put in place. It was about the people who would carry on his work. It was about the lives he had touched, the change he had sparked in the world, and the lesson he had left behind. That true greatness lies not in what you accumulate, but in what you give away. Hattie's voice grew softer as she spoke the final words that would leave the mourners with a lesson to carry with them long after they left the cemetery. "Robert didn't need recognition or applause," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "He didn't need to be celebrated for his actions. What mattered to him was knowing that he had done his part to make the world a little better." The crowd stood still as if collectively holding their breath, absorbing the final lesson Robert Henley had left for them. His legacy was not written in stone or in the awards he had received. It was written in the hearts of the people he had helped, the children he had fought for, and the lives he had changed. "Now I leave you with this," Hattie said, her voice firm but filled with warmth. "How will you be remembered? Not for the things you had or the title you earned, but for the lives you touched and the love you gave." She turned to face Robert's headstone, placing her hand gently on its polished surface. "If Robert taught us anything, it's that true legacy isn't written in stone, it's written in the hearts of the people you lift up." The silence that followed was profound. The mourners stood still, their collective guilt giving way to a deeper understanding of the man they had come to mourn. They had thought they knew Robert Henley, but now they saw him for who he truly was, someone whose legacy wasn't in the awards or the recognition, but in the lives he had touched and the love he had shared. As Hattie took a final step back, her hand resting on Samuel's shoulder, the crowd began to disperse slowly, each person lost in thought. Many approached Hattie and Samuel, offering words of gratitude and promises to honor Robert's legacy. The cemetery, once a place of somber finality, had become a space of renewed purpose. And as the sun began to set on Cypress Grove Cemetery, one thing was clear. Robert Henley's legacy would live on, not just in the trust he had established, but in the hearts of everyone who had learned the truth of who he really was. The man they had thought they knew was far greater than they could have ever imagined, and his greatest gift was one that would continue to give long after his passing. If this story moved you, let it be a reminder that kindness, sacrifice, and true legacy often go unseen, but never unnoticed. Remember Robert's lesson: live a life that leaves a lasting impact on others. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help us continue sharing stories like this one. As the final moments of the funeral ceremony passed, the crowd slowly began to disperse, each person lost in their own thoughts. The truth about Robert Henley had been laid bare, and the weight of it lingered in the air like a heavy fog. They had come to mourn a man they believed they knew, but now they had learned that Robert's true legacy was far more profound than they could have ever imagined. Robert Henley was not just the philanthropist they had admired, not just the generous man who helped those in need. He was a fighter, a protector, and a man who had sacrificed so much for the greater good. His actions, hidden behind the veil of a polished public image, revealed a life of courage, struggle, and a deep, abiding love for those he cared about. The greatest lesson they could take away from today was that true greatness isn't measured by accolades, wealth, or recognition. It's measured by the lives we touch, the people we lift up, and the love we give without expecting anything in return. Addie, standing there beside Robert's headstone, reminded us all that legacy isn't etched in stone, but in the hearts of those we impact. Robert's life, his struggles, and his unwavering commitment to others had left a mark that could never be erased. And that, ultimately, was the greatest gift he could leave behind. For all of us, the story of Robert Henley is a powerful reminder that true success isn't about what we accumulate, it's about what we give. The sacrifices we make for others, the way we lift those around us when they need it most. That is what defines us. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the impact you want to leave on the world. Are you living a life that will be remembered for the love you gave and the people you helped? If you liked this video, please comment with the number 1 to let me know, and if you think there's something I could improve, comment with 0. Your feedback helps me continue to improve and create content that's both meaningful and inspiring. Let's carry Robert's lesson with us: to live a life that leaves a lasting impact. To touch lives, to give love, and to stand up for what is right no matter the cost. Because in the end, it's not the awards we win or the things we own, it's the lives we touch that truly define who we are.